Well, hey, good evening. How are you guys doing? Fantastic. Great to see you guys here for part 2 of our series, Jesus Skeptic. We started off last week saying, for many people and for many generations, the question that people have had about Christianity, about the message of Christianity, about God, Bible, Jesus, faith, has been, is it true? Is it true? Is the story true? Is the message true? Is it reliable? And that's an understandable question. In fact, it's a great question. As I often say, I am a natural born skeptic. I question and doubt everything and everyone. It can be a real character flaw. And if you have doubts and questions about whether or not it is true, I get that. I love to talk about that kind of thing. But more and more, the question that many people are asking these days, and the question really that this series is asking is it good? Is it good? Is the message of Christianity, is the message about Jesus, is it actually good? Even if it is true or true-ish or partially true, is it good? Is it good for society? Is it good for the world? Is it good for women and children? Is it good for the oppressed and the marginalized? Is it good for people, or is it dangerous? Is it like toxic and harmful? And since the early 2000s, there have been a wave of renowned skeptics with best-selling books that have been arguing actually that Christianity is bad. That's actually bad for the world and bad for history and bad for society, that religion in general and Christianity in particular is the source of evil and injustice and depression and racism, sexism, violence, war, and ignorance. And sadly, horribly, if you will, there is way too much evidence, way too many examples, both ancient and current, of that suspicion. And I think like even one example of anyone ever associating their name with God and doing something harmful would be one too many, including the number of times that I have been that person. And yet there are way more than just one example of people who have associated with God or faith or Christianity, abusing power, abusing people, covering it up, failing to listen to victims, failing to be a voice for the voiceless. And there are many examples that add fuel to the suspicion and really maybe even the vitriol and the revulsion that people might have towards Christianity. Now, part of the problem we said last week is just with that word by itself, the word Christian or the word Christianity. I mean, that word just carries so much baggage, right? It means so many different things to so many different people. We said last week, if you were to ask 10 people on the street what that word means to them, you would get 10 very different opinions, and they would not be emotionally neutral. People would have some emotion about how they felt about that word. And part of the reason why is because Christian or Christianity has become a religion. It did not begin as one. It actually began as the unreligion, but it has become a religion, and not just a religion, it has become the world's largest religion. Billions and billions of people, roughly a third of the world's population, associates themselves with that name in some way or another. People who believe all sorts of things, do all sorts of things, say all sorts of things, are for and against all sorts of things and all sorts of people, often things that have absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. And so if you or someone you know has walked away or just like begun to distance themselves from God and faith or Jesus or Christianity, I get it. I understand that. But what they may not know and what you may not know is that the original Jesus movement and the movement that was launched, the Jesus movement, launched a wave of world-changing good that has positively transformed every value, every ideal, every assumption, every institution that we actually hold dear, from education to hospitals to orphanages to modern science, from women's rights and children's rights to the whole idea of human rights and human dignity, to our values of compassion and humility and charity and generosity, all of which exist today in our world as they do today because of Jesus and the movement that he launched, including our ideals of social justice, freedom, and racial equality. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson penned these famous words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and hypothetically, I'm sure he meant women, are created equal, that they somehow are endowed with rights. And in reality, Thomas Jefferson says that's just self-evident. That's just self-evident. Just look around. But in reality, there have been many, many thinkers who have observed there is nothing self-evident about either of these two words. When it comes to human beings, there's nothing self-evident about it. In fact, sadly, slavery, not equality, has been the global norm from the beginning of human civilization. It has been one of history's universal. Every society, every civilization on every continent seems to have enslaved other human beings, from China to India to Africa and Europe to the indigenous peoples of North and South America. Long before Columbus's voyage ever got here, slave labor built the Mayan temples and the Egyptian pyramids and the Greek Parthenon and the Great Wall of China. Slavery has actually been civilization's norm. In fact, in the case of the ancient Near East, their very origin stories assumed and justified human slavery. In fact, in the very famous Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, it was read by the high priest of Babylon every year at their New Year's festival. The stories were told by parents to their children. It was during a war between the generations of gods, and generations always have a hard time with each other, right? It was a war between the generations of God, the gods, that the world, the skies and the sea and the ocean, the land and creatures were formed from the body parts of butchered gods. And it's a full 6 tablets in to the Enuma Elish that human beings finally enter the story. And the way they enter the story is this. The lesser gods are complaining because they're sick of doing Marduk's work. Marduk is the champion god. He's like the king. He takes it easy. And the other gods always have to do his work. And so they're complaining that they have to do this work. And so Marduk comes up with a solution. And here's his solution. He says, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create, and upon him the services of the gods will be imposed that they may be at ease. The servitude would be imposed upon him. So he kills one of the gods that none of them really like anyway, and he mixes that god's blood with the clay, and he makes man out of the blood of a dead god that nobody really liked. What are humans in their story? Well, they're savages. They're savages, they're an afterthought, somewhat accidental in that way, and they are slaves. They are created to be slaves, so of course they were enslaved. Of course they were, by their kings and anyone with power, kings who they said were in the image of God, and people had no rights, no intrinsic value or worth or purpose, and certainly anything like equality. In fact, Plato, we talked about him last week, said that was just natural. Like the nature of things, Plato said what was natural is that the better have more than the worst, that the powerful have more than the weaker. Justice, in Plato's mind, justice was superior people ruling over and having more than inferior people. That's just, it's inequality is, he's like, look around. It's baked into nature, including human beings. And justice consists in the enforcement of inequality. And his student Aristotle said this, for that some should rule and others be ruled, that's not just only necessary, it's actually expedient. It's kind of smart and practical when you think about it. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjugation and others for rule. And to Plato and Aristotle and all ancient thinkers, what was obvious to them, what was self-evident to them, was that some human beings were made to be what they phrased living tools. They were made to be living tools, just like human machines, to be used by those who were more powerful than they were. Thomas Jefferson called equality self-evident, and there have been many brilliant thinkers, from the Greek fathers of Western philosophy to today's new atheists, that say there's nothing self-evident about that. There is nothing in nature that implies anything about equality or dignity or value or worth. So where do we get that idea? Where did we get our ideas of equality and freedom and our idea of justice, not Plato's? Why is that so self-evident to us? And the answer is, of course, well, we got it from Jesus. And the movement that he launched, and into this very fallen world of inequality and injustice and slavery and oppression, where people with power and status always leveraged their power and status by nature, lording it over those who were beneath them, men over women and children, rich over poor, free over slave, powerful over powerless, where advantage is always exploited for the benefit of the person who has the advantage. Into that world stepped a first century Jewish rabbi who elevated women, who valued children, who loved the poor, who touched the untouchable and forgave the unforgivable and embraced the sick. And he leveraged every advantage he had for others, never exploiting it for his own, never exploiting advantage for his own benefit, but only leveraging the advantage that he had for the benefit of those who did not have it. And he called that love. That's what it looked like to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind, and strength, and what it looked like to love your neighbor as yourself, whom he defined as the person in front of you right now in need. That's love. And then he told his followers that if they were truly going to be his followers, if they wanted to be his disciples, that they must do the same to the same crazy extent that he did. And they believed him. And they did it. And they took their cue about humanity and what human beings were worth from a very different story. The story of one true creator God, of being capable of saying, let there be light. And with that word to ignite into existence all energy and matter. Thank you, Einstein, equals MC square, of being that wise, that brilliant, that capable, that powerful, that good, who then at the pinnacle of his creation, not as an accidental afterthought, said, let us make mankind in our image. Not just the pinnacle of creation, the very image of God. Now, ancients would have been familiar with this idea of people being the image of God, but for them, it was their kings or their pharaohs or their Caesars. They were like gods. They were the images of the God. But Genesis is actually saying something radical, that all human beings, that all mankind has that dignity. They are all image bearers of the Creator God. And that's what it truly means to be human. That's what it means to be you, to be yourself. That was revolutionary. That is unheard of in the history of ancient civilizations. There are no parallels to an idea like this. Now, the next statement is equally revolutionary, and it follows from the first. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule. So that they may rule over the creation that I've made. And in complete contrast to every surrounding worldview, God says, you are not to worship nature. No. You, and by the way, you, not just the kings and the elites and so forth, you as humanity will rule over nature and rule over creation as kings and queens, people of nobility and dignity, to work and create and build and serve and help and love and bring beauty and goodness as we reflect the goodness and the creativity and the wisdom and the power of our Creator, that we are actually all created, born to rule. We are all of that. And then the story breaks out into a little poem, a little song. The story goes like this. And so he did it. He created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, not just male, but male and female in his image. And the Genesis origin story dropped like a bomb in the ancient world. It introduced a radically alternative, different, unparalleled worldview. See, according to the ancient origin stories, if you had grown up in this world, this would be your story, that you are an afterthought of the gods, born a slave to serve them, and you have no intrinsic worth or rights or purpose. That's what a human is. According to our modern origin stories, our current origin stories, our modern origin stories say humans are, next slide right there, it's coming up. There it is. You are an accident of nature. That's all you are. Just an accidental bag of molecules, just material, just the stuff, nothing more than that. Born a slave to your DNA, no free will, no choice, no intrinsic worth, rights, or value, and certainly, by the way, of no greater value than any other species. And in fact, to think that humans have any value greater than anything else living is speciesist. It's not reality. You're just molecules, just like everything else. But the Genesis origin story tells a very different story of what it means to be human, that all human beings are the purposeful creation of a brilliant, loving God who has made them in his image, who has made all of us in his image to reflect the nobility and the glory and the dignity and the efficacy of God to the world around us all human beings, all of them, all of us, image bearers of the Creator God, created equal. All of us created with equal value, equal dignity, and equal treatment. I just wonder, just as an aside, like what would happen? What would happen if we all adopted that story as our own? That became our story and we believed it. We believed it not only in how we view ourselves and what we actually expect of ourselves, but how we view every other single human being on the planet. And what if we actually sought to live that reality, to live that way? Well, the first followers of Jesus, they took that story and they took the example and the words of Jesus and they created communities, in the words of Plato, very unnatural communities, very unnatural, that treated everyone, for all of our differences, for all of our face value inequalities, treated everyone as equal. In fact, as one of their earliest thinkers, known as Paul of Tarsus, you may know of him as Paul the Apostle, as he put it in a letter he wrote, here in these communities, he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek. That ancient line doesn't matter for us. There's neither slave nor free. That line doesn't matter for us. Neither male nor female. That line of social status, that doesn't matter either. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And in the words of Thomas Cahill, they created the world's first egalitarian societies. Or again, in another letter that Paul wrote, he's talking about the image of God being restored in us as we begin to follow Jesus. And he says here, as he's talking about this image being restored in us, and he's talking to these Christians in the Greek city of Colossae, he says here it is again, neither Greek or Jew, one of the ancient world's greatest ethnic divides, two groups of people who did not associate with each other or respect each other. In this community, that's not a thing for us. Neither circumcised nor uncircumcised. Let's go back up to that, where were we? Neither barbarian, which is what Greeks refer to anyone who didn't speak Greek. They were just barbarians. Or Scythians. They were tribes that lived up around the Black Sea that were considered particularly barbarian, especially by people who lived in communities like Colossae. They were despised. He's like, that's not a thing for us, neither slave nor free, but Christ is all. Christ is all and is in all. In other words, we don't just reflect to each other the image of God. We actually reflect to each other the image of the Messiah, who is the image of God. And as he says this, he's not saying that the distinctions and the differences cease to exist. In fact, he talks in other letters about how marvelous the differences actually are. He's not advocating what in some ways today is called color blindness, like I just don't see race or I don't see the difference, which isn't really a reality anyway. It's a way of, I think, trying to make ourselves feel better or something. He's not actually advocating a blindness to the difference. There's an appreciation to our differences and our cultures and where we come from and what we bring to the table. But those differences for these first Christians, they create no difference in terms of our equality, our value, our dignity, or our treatment of each other, which this is huge. He goes on to say, therefore, as God's chosen people, like this new humanity that God is creating, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, which is literally, by the way, the phrase he literally uses here, he's writing in Greek. And in fact, if you're reading in a different translation, you might see this, the bowels of compassion. That's literally the phrase, the bowels of mercy, the intestines of compassion. In other words, you have this deep, gut level feeling of care and compassion and interest and mercy for every other single person in the community. You clothe yourself with that, and kindness and humility, back up, and humility, which was not a virtue in the ancient world. Freely and willingly stepping down from your deserved status level, that's not a thing. That's not a virtue. And the followers of Jesus made that a virtue, willingly stepping down to the person who is socially beneath you to elevate them. You clothe yourself with humility and gentleness and patience. And you do this not just for your peers, not just for the people who are like you or your social equals out there, but you do that particularly in the context of diversity across all of these historical divisions, and you just change the way you treat everybody else. And then he says, bear with each other, because differences create misunderstandings, and misunderstandings create offenses and grievances. And to live this way is going to require a community of people to have a wide level of bandwidth for one another, to have grace to bear with one another, and then to forgive and to forgive freely, to forgive as the Lord has forgiven us. So there's grace in this community, the same grace that God has towards you, you're extending towards everyone else in the community. And over all these virtues, he says, you put on love. You put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. And they began to do that. They began to actually do that, to love across lines, across categories that no one had ever even considered doing before, let alone actually acting upon. And they took Jesus seriously, and they changed the world. In fact, as we said last week, they took Jesus seriously, and they created our world. The world that we consider normal. In fact, many of the leaders of the Jesus movement in the early days began to refer to themselves as slaves, which is something in the ancient world a free person would never do. They began to refer to themselves as slaves. Peter and Paul and James the Just and his brother Jude, they began to call themselves slaves. And in fact, Paul wrote in one of his letters that Jesus himself had taken the form of a slave and died what everyone knew was the slave's death, that he was flipping the ladder. That he was flipping the ladder, and that they were too. They were to have the same mentality towards one another. And though initially they were this powerless minority movement with no voice in the society, they weren't seeking to stomp out slavery in the world around them. They had no voice to do that. What they actually did, though, was to completely transform it in their own communities. In fact, as one Athenian philosopher, Aristides, we said last week, observed, any slaves that they have among them, they persuade them to become Christians because of their love for them. They love slaves, and they make them their brothers and sisters without discrimination. They make them family, their family. And there are actually stories from the second and third generation of followers of Jesus, of slaves and even female slaves. This is huge. Female slaves becoming leaders in the community, that everyone else is following their leadership. And this is so well known in the ancient world that one of the earliest opponents to Christianity, a 2nd century philosopher named Celsus, actually criticized the entire movement as a movement of slaves, women, and little children, which he just had you can sense the vitriol dripping from his mouth as he writes that. And then, as the movement gained influence and power, they began, for the first time in history, the first recorded incidences of anyone ever opposing the very notion of slavery. They began to oppose slavery on its face. In fact, Gregory of Nyssa writes this: if a man makes that which truly belongs to God, these are human beings, they all belong to God. If a man makes that which truly belongs to God in his own private property, by allotting himself sovereignty over his own race, and then thinks himself a master of men and women, what could follow but an arrogance exceeding all nature from the one who sees himself as something other than the ones who are ruled? And in a very non-Plato, non-Aristotle way, he is asserting the fundamental equality of every human being, the ruled and the ones ruled over. This had never happened before. And then he just went off on the whole idea of ever trying to buy or sell a human being. And he says, how much does rationality cost? He's referring to a human being as a rational human being. How much does that cost? How much do you pay for that? How many obols, which was a kind of currency in their world, how many obols do you pay for the image of God? What does that cost? How many staters, another form of currency, did you get for selling the God-formed man? And then other leading followers of Jesus and his contemporaries like Augustine and John Chrysostom joined in, and his brother, Gregory's brother, Basil of Caesarea, known as Basil the Great, who had actually started one of history's first hospitals. We talked a little bit about that last week. Basil the Great, or Basil of Caesarea, was amazing. And bit by bit, slavery was actually dismantled. It was completely taken apart until it no longer existed in the Mediterranean world where Christianity had taken root. It was gone. They ended it. But then, as we all know, it didn't stay dead. And in the middle of the last millennium, driven by European colonial expansion, which encompassed many evils, a form of what's called chattel slavery, and a particularly race-based form of that slavery just came roaring back in the 1500s to 1800s. An estimated 12 million African slaves were brought to the colonies that Europe was creating. And tribes and kingdoms in Africa had long, like centuries old, millennia old, traditions of slavery and capturing competing tribes and selling them and so forth. And it seemed to be a small step for them to begin to capture their enemies and sell them to Arab and European traders. And once again, an army of sincere followers of Jesus, known as the abolitionists, rose up to oppose the evil of this. And men and women gave their lives and their livelihoods for the freedom of other people whom they may never even meet, because Jesus had said that his mission was to release the captives and to free the oppressed. And they believed him, that he didn't just mean spiritually, but he meant literally. And then beginning with the Quakers, which was a movement of very devout Christians in the 1600s who wrote the world's first anti-slavery literature, quoting Jesus over and over and over again, what it actually meant to love your neighbor as yourself. And they wrote petitions to Parliament, pleading with them to outlaw slavery and declaring that slavery contradicts the good news, they called it an Old English word, the gospel, which means good news, that it contradicts the good news of Jesus. And this document right here is one of the earliest known documents demanding universal human rights. The idea of universal human rights for all people. And then there was William Wilberforce, who was initially, he was not a Christian. He was not a humanitarian. He did not care. He was a very wealthy man. He was an aristocrat elected to Parliament in England. And then he became a Christian. And he started reading the teachings of Jesus for himself. And he launched a political movement in England to end slavery. And he looked around at the so-called Christians around him in England. And he said, you cannot call yourself a Christian if you do not follow the words of Jesus, if you aren't actually reading the words of Jesus and doing what he said. And he published this very famous anti-slavery book known as Real Christianity. And this book blew up on Amazon, like everybody was reading it, and went through many, many editions. In fact, this is a copy of the cover of the 16th edition of that book. And Wilberforce gave the rest of his life to seeing England end slavery, which it finally did in 1807, ending slavery and the slave trade in the entire British Empire. And then comes some of my personal heroes. Some of you know I grew up in the south side of Chicago, and long before there was anything called Black History Month, that was just history for us. That's what we read. And we were reading books about people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And I was fascinated by the Underground Railroad. It sounded so cool, like so punk rock. There's an Underground Railroad. And there was this network of churches and houses, often the houses of pastors, but often maybe just the houses thousands of regular followers of Jesus, businessmen and women from the south all the way to the north. And then there were these conductors. There were these conductors on the Underground Railroad who would find escaped slaves in the south and lead them through this hidden network to freedom in the north. And it was incredibly dangerous. It was incredibly dangerous for everyone involved, from the south all the way to the north. And one of the most famous conductors is a woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, she was a devoted follower of Jesus. She was raised by parents with strong faith. She escaped slavery in her 20s, in her early 20s. Imagine this, because some of you have been that age before. Like, you remember when you were. And she became, shortly after she escaped slavery, she was already a follower of Jesus. She became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and she risked her life returning to the South over and over and over again. For 10 years, she guided an estimated 300 slaves to their freedom through the Underground Railroad, so much so that her friends started calling her Moses. Moses, after the great Jewish hero of the Hebrew scriptures who led the people of God out of slavery in Egypt to the promised land, and they began to call her that. And her faith was so strong. Her faith was so strong, and that constant moment by moment part of her life, that she was known to stop in the woods and ask God out loud for directions as she and the people she was leading were being chased and pursued. She was following the guidance of God. That's what she believed. But I've always loved Harriet Tubman. I remember reading her stories, just so fascinated with her and others on the Underground Railroad. But my favorite of them all, my favorite of these heroes and my favorite of these books that we would read seemed to, I like read this one again and again and again. I don't know how many times I read this one. It's about Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, he was an escaped slave who taught himself how to read, learning it from some white children in his neighborhood. And I remember lying in bed at night with this book, and it was this illustrated biography of Frederick Douglass that my family had. I was just so utterly captivated by him and his whole story. And Douglass wrote in his autobiography, he wrote this: "I was not more than 13 years old when in my loneliness and destitution, I longed for someone who I could go to, like a father or a protector. It was the preaching of a white Methodist minister named Hanson was the means of causing me to feel that in God, I might actually have such a friend." He goes on to say, "I cannot say I had a very distinct notion of what was required of me, but one thing I did know well: I was wretched and had no means of making myself otherwise." Powerful. Then he goes on, he says, "I consulted a good old color man named Charles Lawson, and in tones of holy affection, he told me to pray and to cast all my care upon God. And this I sought to do, though for weeks I was a poor, broken-hearted mourner traveling through doubts and fears." And then he says, "I finally found my burden lightened and my heart relieved. And get this, I loved all mankind." Something happened in me. I loved all mankind, slaveholders not exempted. Though I abhorred slavery more than ever, I saw the world in a new light. And my great concern was actually that everyone would be converted. That's my great concern. My great concern is that everyone would come to see the world in this new light that I had come to see it through, this light of the love of Christ that had transformed his life. And after all the physical and racial abuse that Douglass had experienced, he had every right to spend the rest of his life angry and bitter and seeking revenge. But God had radically transformed his heart. So much so that it was now love and not hate that motivated him to give the rest of his life to fight, by the way, not just to end slavery, which he most certainly fought for until it was done, but along with many of the abolitionists like Sojourner Truth and Charles Finney, who my brother's named after, what a fabulous story, and Harriet Tubman and so many others. They fought not just to end slavery, but to actually change things and make things better, like to transform education so that people had free access to it, to create jobs and training to help freed slaves build a whole new life, and also to work for women's rights. Almost all of them were doing that at the same time. In other words, Jesus' vision of a right side up kingdom where humanity flourishes and all wrong things are made right and people are being restored in the image of God and made complete and full and whole again. These were radical people. These were radical people. They took Jesus seriously. From the earliest Christians who were working to end slavery in the Mediterranean world to the Jesus followers like William Wilberforce and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Charles Finney and on, they took Jesus seriously at great personal cost, often at great risk, and some of them losing their lives in the process. And this was not a matter for them of signing on to the dominant, respectable religion and giving a head nod to a couple of belief statements. This was a serious decision for them to follow in a way of being, in a way of living, to follow in the way of Jesus that would not just transform their own lives, but would actually suck them into something bigger, that would actually recruit them into a movement that was designed to transform everyone else's lives as well, especially the least of these for good. That was Frederick Douglass's passion. And there's not even time to talk about so many others. There's Charles Finney, Charles Torrey, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, who formed the Liberator newspaper, the first anti-slavery newspaper. Again, men and women who based their lives on their faith in Jesus and what he taught, following him to do something different in the world that the world had never really seen before. They took Jesus seriously and they changed the world. But you might ask, well, hold on. Okay, all right, so maybe it just seems like maybe a lot of the people who tried to end slavery and fight for equality were Christians. Okay, but hey, wasn't it also Christians who supported slavery? I mean, what about that? Weren't they all Christians too? And it's true. It's true that many of those who supported and even fought for the legitimacy of the institution of slavery, and then even after slavery ended, fought for the inequality of their fellow human beings, called themselves Christian. But those who opposed them, they didn't consider them to be so, at least not legitimately, because Christianity had become a religion. It has become a religion. And there are many people who call themselves Christian, but are Christian really in name only and a couple of beliefs that they nod their head to. And Jesus predicted that would be so. Jesus had actually predicted that there would be many who say, Lord, Lord, but don't actually do what he says. And Jesus said, yeah, I don't know those people. I don't think we've ever met. They're not mine. And for those opposing slavery, which they all did, by the way, universally on purely Christian grounds, that God has created all human beings in his image equally, that God redeems us equally, we are forgiven and freed equally, that Jesus came to set the captives free, not just spiritually, but physically and literally to make all wrong things right. And for them, you could not follow Jesus. You could not really follow Jesus and not be utterly opposed to any human inequality and any anti-human, anti-God institution like slavery. In fact, I mentioned William Wilberforce and his book that often goes by the title, Real Christianity. Here's the whole title. You can see why they just call it Real Christianity. The whole title is A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the middle and higher classes of this country, contrasted with real Christianity, with the real thing, with people who actually follow Jesus. To truly follow Jesus in Wilberforce's and in their minds was to actually do what he said, to actually follow what he taught, to have your life, to have our lives so transformed by his words and his example and his love that it is bringing becoming increasingly the expression of our own lives as well. Like, that's what that word actually means. But the charge that Christians supported slavery raises an honest question, I think. Maybe a scary question, because there are ways in which my life does not always fully express Jesus' vision of a new humanity, of a right side up kingdom, of everything wrong being made right. There are ways in which my life does not always fully express that, and there just might be ways in which your life doesn't fully express that either, and we can all become blind to that. We can all become blind to things that we've just grown accustomed to, that we consider normal, and we can begin to accept ways that we look at and see people that Jesus does not find acceptable. And so the question this raises for all of us, I think, is, so what does that mean for me? They took Jesus seriously and changed the world. Do I? Will I? What would that look like now? Because you see, there's still injustice, and there's still inequality, and there's still racism, and there's still poverty, and there's still sexism, and there's still slavery. In fact, the International Labor Organization estimates that there are over 40 million slaves in the world today, including right here in Orange County. Slavery, human trafficking, is a $150 billion a year industry. And by the way, just as a side note, a significant percentage of those slaves are working in the sex trade. And if you use pornography and you consider that a victimless crime, you need to know that you are at least implicitly, and often enough without even maybe knowing it, explicitly supporting that industry. So what does that look like? What does that look like for me? What does it look like now for me to embrace the vision of the early Jesus movement, a vision of complete equality across any line that I might imagine, of value and dignity and treatment and love? Is there anyone in my life that I don't look at that way? Is there anyone in my life that I begin to look at as not maybe worthy of as much of that as someone else? What does it look like for us to join the movement of Paul of Tarsus and James the Just and Gregory of Nyssa and William Wilberforce and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, and in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who's quoting the prophet Amos, till justice rolls down like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream? What does it look like for me to jump into that? And by the way, skeptic or not, that's what we're invited to do. That's what we're all invited to do, to join that movement, their movement. And can you imagine? Can you imagine if we all did? How it might upset a few things in my life if I began to take Jesus that seriously, but can you imagine the world-changing good that might come from an entire community of people that take Jesus so seriously, that what he said and his vision of his right side up kingdom, where everything is opposite and everything wrong is getting made right and made whole again, becomes so compelling that someone would live that out regardless of the cost, even if it cost us our livelihoods, even if it cost us our lives? Can you imagine what might happen if people took that seriously? And Jesus says, follow me. Join that movement and see what happens. Now, we're going to jump back into this series next week with another question that people have against whether or not Christianity is good or bad for the world, and that has to do with science. And so I hope you'll come back and join us next week for part 3 of our series, Jesus, Faith, and Science. Is Christianity anti-science, anti-knowledge? Does it promote ignorance? And I hope you'll come back and join us for that. But let me close us in prayer tonight. And as we pray, maybe you just might honestly say, even if you're a skeptic, even if you don't know what you believe or whatever, you might ask God, or if you're not even sure you believe in God, just ask yourself or whatever you think might be out there, is there any of that in me? Is there any of that in me? Heavenly Father, can you help me see something that I might be blind to? Ways that I might have grown accustomed to inequality or injustice or oppression or poverty or slavery, or any of the great evils that you came to just restore wholeness to? Can you show me that? And I pray for all of us that we individually and collectively would become the kind of people who just see everyone through your eyes in that new light that Frederick Douglass talked about, where we truly do love all humankind the way you do, and that our greatest desire in this world is that everyone else would come to know you and see in that same light. And I pray that for myself. I pray for that for all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks so much, John. I'm loving this series and the things that we're getting to unpack in it. And one of the things that we've always got available is if you go, hey, I want to watch that again. I want to think through that. There's somebody that I have in my life that I think that they would appreciate what we're talking about. One of the ways that we can always just be able to connect with it again is we've got all of our messages up on our YouTube channel. And so if you want to rewatch this or go back to last week, or there's somebody in your life, you got a friend, you go, what, I'd like to share this with them because they're familiar with the term Christian, but maybe they would be challenged to look at what it really looks like to live out the way of Jesus. Well, we've got them up there, and I'd love to encourage you to share that with them, or also invite them back with you next weekend for part 3. Hey, as we're winding down, just a couple things to mention. The first is we talked about this Connect card a little bit earlier on. Love to get this from everybody, especially if it happens to be one of your first times. We've got the paper copy, and we've also got it available online or on our app. And so you can spend some time right now letting us know anything you want to indicate on there. If there's anything you're going through, any questions that you got, let us know. And again, if you're planning on attending the Terra Nova tour that's happening next Sunday, you can just indicate that. Just write tour me on there. We'll get you all squared away. We got lunch taken care of, but if you need childcare, just write the names and the ages of the kids, and we'll get that all set up. And as we're winding down, one of the things we get to do as followers of Jesus is we get to walk in the way of generosity. And Jesus' followers changed the world through just living this life where they were others directed, others focused, thinking not just about themselves, but how they could love the people who were created in God's image that were before them. And so we take that seriously as a community. We love just seeking to make the love of God famous. And if you're part of the Terra Nova community, we've got ways just to be able to give and to support that mission. Within our program, we've got an offering envelope, and you can also give online or the Terra Nova app, but that's just one thing that we love to step into, of being people who take that seriously, of following Jesus' example of generosity and sacrificial love. Well, hey, as we're winding down once more, I want to thank you so much for being with us. As you're heading out, Connect card, anything you want to leave behind, we've got some people that are at the doors, and you can drop those off in the baskets there. But again, I want to invite you back for part 3 of Jesus Skeptic next week. Hope to see you and some friends with you. Have a great time. God bless you all. See you soon.